This is The Listening Tube.
Hello, thank you for putting your ear to the listening tube. I'm your host, Bob Woodley. I'm sure glad the owner of Honda isn't saving my country billions of dollars. On this episode, we'll hear about how a New York mayor dug deep but still got the cold shoulder, and I'll have a chat with a New York City firefighter about one of the city's most horrific events. But first,
Not the headlines.
I read a lot of stories from a lot of different sources. If there's one thing I've observed, it's that the media hasn't learned a thing. There's simply no objectivity. There is only left and right, conservative and liberal. Granted, there is just plain news that all news organizations could report without pushing an agenda one way or the other, but that stuff is boring. It doesn't rile up either side. The legacy media decided that it was no longer any fun to report straight news. Everything has to be able to be slanted in the direction of one ideology or the other. It seems like the only important thing now is that the media not report anything that could be interpreted as unifying. No matter how important, no matter how humane, no matter how inspiring, if it can't be used in a way to promote some other cause, the legacy media would rather let it go unreported. It's equivalent to a lie of omission. It's just like if somebody was about to take a step in the dark, but before they did, they asked you if there's a 30-foot deep hole on the other side. You know there's a 50-foot deep hole on the other side, but you simply say, no, there isn't a 30-foot hole on the other side. The person asking the question feels assured that it's safe to take the step. They do, and fall into a 50-foot hole. You didn't lie when you said there wasn't a 30-foot hole, but you also didn't tell them the hole was 50 feet deep. You led them to believe there was no hole. While I was in Air Force basic training back in the 80s, I wrote a letter to my recruiter, who was based in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I wanted him to know that I was thankful for all of his help and to let him know that everything he told me was true. I also made sure to point out that he didn't tell me everything. There were a couple of things I would have liked to know ahead of time, and I felt he certainly could have anticipated that. But unlike my Air Force recruiter, the legacy media tries every day to mislead me and plant ideas in my head with not just the stories they choose to write, but also by the way they write them. I've pointed out on the listening tube a number of times that the author of the story doesn't write the headline, and often the headline is written in such a way as to misrepresent what the story actually tells us. That's very common. But there's also deception inside some of the stories. Well, many of the stories. Some of the methods are so ingrained in how stories are now written that I'm not even sure the authors are aware of it every time. But mostly, it's done on purpose. Certain words or phrases have been woven into news reporting that are meant to sow doubt in the reader. Words like without any evidence are often used to sway the reader of a story into believing that whatever the allegation is, it's probably not true. Even sometimes ignoring the fact that there is evidence, but the author refuses to acknowledge it. For example, a recent story from CNN about the lawsuit against Greenpeace in North Dakota, a lawsuit that is more than a decade into the process, has a paragraph that states, President Donald Trump's return to the White House has ushered in a wide rollback of climate and environmental policies, an emboldening of fossil fuel companies, and a crackdown on free speech. None of that has anything to do with this lawsuit. Let's look over that quickly. The president has rolled back climate and environmental policies and unleashed the fossil fuel industry. But a crackdown on free speech couldn't be further from the truth. Some people are confusing free speech with supporting terrorists. There's a difference. The real threat to free speech was the last Democratic administration, who we now know used threats to all of the largest social media companies to eliminate or minimize any speech the left deemed to be contrary to the party line. Reporters were reprimanded and fired for violating the standards set by the Biden administration. The current administration has given voices to those who never had it before. They've given access to news gatherers who never had access before. For CNN to suggest Donald Trump is cracking down on free speech is simply incorrect. But that's what they want you to believe. So they must omit that President Trump is the most accessible president in modern history and also started a social media site called Truth Social where you're free to say anything you want. By the way, Greenpeace lost the lawsuit and has to pay $660 million. You'll hear it called an attack on free speech, but it's really people being held responsible for their actions, not their words. Sometimes, though, some of the media companies don't try to hide it as much as they just put it out there and assume no one will notice, or that those who do will agree. Now, there's no doubt about the friction between President Trump and the Associated Press. The AP Style Guide is the Bible of journalism, and there's a lot in it that promotes progressive ideals in the way the guidance is presented. Plus, the AP has so far refused to recognize the new name of the Gulf of America. So the president excluded the AP from some of its privileges. Not a total exclusion, but a slap on the wrist, so to speak. So now the AP writes a story praising CBS for how critical they've been of President Trump in their news coverage. But they make it look like CBS is some kind of a hero for doing it. Just a reminder, CBS is the subject of a $20 billion lawsuit brought by none other than Donald Trump for the way they allegedly tried to influence the last election by craftily editing the answers given by Kamala Harris on a 60 Minutes interview. So both CBS and the AP have an axe to grind. The story calls CBS's reaction to the lawsuit fast and hard-hitting stories critical of the new administration, pointing out that every episode of 60 Minutes since the inauguration has included such a feature. The most recent fast and/or hard-hitting story was about a concert that was canceled because of a new Trump policy. The concert was to feature the U.S. Marine Corps Band. Did I ever tell you that I never met a Marine I didn't like? Anyway, the concert in question was to include winners of a competition who had earned the honor of performing with the Marine Corps Band. That would be pretty cool. Being in a military band is the second best job you can have in the military. What's the first best? The one I had, radio personality. So why did the concert get canceled? Because the president had prohibited DEI practices in the military. Well, the whole federal government. I know, you're thinking, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it turns out that in order to be eligible to compete for the honor of performing with the Marine Corps Band, you had to be non-white. In other words, anybody can enter the contest, assuming you know how to play a musical instrument and you're not a white kid. The Associated Press is glowing about CBS doing a story critical of a policy that prohibits bigotry against white people. The AP is praising CBS for supporting racism. Maybe I was wrong when I said the news won't report anything unifying. Both of these news disseminating organizations are telling you that Donald Trump denied a bunch of black kids an opportunity specifically because they're black. But the truth is, Trump doesn't care what color the kids are. He only cares that one kind of kid was excluded from competing based on the color of their skin. Prohibiting DEI policies and practices ensures that we don't judge people by the color of their skin. The CBS story that the AP praises is in support of racist policies, but they make it seem okay as long as only white kids are excluded. They either don't recognize the racism or they refuse to acknowledge it. But their ignorance can't explain the next example of the Associated Press intentionally creating stories critical of the Trump administration. And this one got two MSNBC hosts in trouble for parroting the falsehood. A story by the Associated Press credited Tulsi Gabbard, the former Democrat who is now the Director of National Intelligence for Donald Trump, with saying that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are very good friends. The headline even said, Gabbard says Trump and Putin are very good friends, focused on strengthening ties. Two MSNBC hosts took that ball and ran with it, claiming that it was a display of Trump's disconnect from American values and dangerous, with guests supporting the viewpoint. Both hosts wound up voicing corrections when they realized that the friendship the original AP story was speaking of was between Donald Trump and India's Prime Minister, not Russia's president. The AP later acknowledged their mistake and retracted the story, admitting it did not meet AP standards. While the AP Style Guide has been the go-to reference for journalists for decades, the AP itself seems to have forgotten about style or guidelines.
Let's go back through the listening tube for this week in history.
This week in 1900, the mayor of New York City, Robert Anderson Van Wyck, I think that's how you pronounce it, Van Wyck, Van Wyck, W-Y-C-K, breaks ground for a new underground rapid transit railroad that would link Manhattan and Brooklyn. He was the first mayor to govern after the consolidation of the 5 boroughs, Bronx, Brooklyn, Manhattan, Queens, and Staten Island. The now famous New York City subway would open its first line about 4.5 years later. You might think that the subway might be what Mayor Van Wyck would be remembered for, but that's not the case. Otherwise, you would have already known what we just heard. But Mayor Van Wyck is remembered as a figurehead who took orders from Tammany Hall, which is defined by Wikipedia as a Democratic pressure group. So when the only company licensed to bring ice to New York piers decided to double the price of ice, it caused an uproar among the Tammany Hall base. This was in the years before refrigeration, and poor people couldn't afford to pay 60 cents for 100 pounds of ice. It was later discovered that the mayor had over $500,000 worth of stock in the ice company.
Send email to thelisteningtube@outlook.com.
But it was fire that made the news in New York City this week in 1911. My guest this week is a retired New York City firefighter who's done research and written a book about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Among the most tragic events ever to strike the Big Apple, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire has left a lasting impression on fire prevention and building codes that still exist today. Andrew Serra shared some of what he learned from his research about this tragic event. You're a retired New York City fire chief. How long were you with the department?
I was a captain, actually. I retired.
Captain?
25 years.
Wow. Okay. So You saw quite a bit. When did you retire?
A little over a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago at this point.
Were you an active firefighter during the terrorist attacks in 2001?
Yeah, I was. I started in 1998, so I had about 3 years on the job at 9/11 during the attacks.
And what
Yep.
was your role that day?
I was a firefighter. I was working in Red Hook, Brooklyn at the time, which is it's right near the entrance to the Battery Tunnel. So units from that area were among some of the first on the scene after the attacks began, and companies from my firehouse had an engine company and a ladder company, two different types of units, and both were dispatched to the scene. I was supposed to be off that morning. I was home, and then both companies were at the scene during the collapse. I responded from my home shortly after the second plane hit the tower and drove to the firehouse. And a number of us who were off duty that morning, we actually borrowed a delivery truck from a hardware store across the street from the firehouse, and we loaded it up with tools and we headed on in. And then I think arrived sometime between or just after the second collapse. We
Wow.
arrived.
Well, must certainly a traumatic day for everyone, and mostly New York City first responders, certainly. But we're here to talk about something entirely different, something that happened 90 years earlier, almost 90 years earlier, and that is the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. So on a Saturday afternoon, a fire breaks out in a textile factory in New York. Who was in the building when the fire began?
Among others, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company was the largest shirtwaist manufacturer at the time. A shirtwaist, for those who don't know, it's a type of women's blouse that was very popular in the early 20th century. And this particular company was very successful. They occupied 3 floors, the top 3 floors of a 10-story loft building. And no one knows for sure, but they estimate somewhere between 400 and 500 employees were on the upper 3 floors when the fire broke out.
Wow.
Most
On a
seamstresses, but everyone from the two owners to, everyone in between, managers and receptionists and seamstresses, hundreds of seamstresses.
So things were still going pretty well there, even though it was a Saturday afternoon.
Yeah, the busy season was just about to start. They were ramping up orders, and they worked 6 days a week as a rule. And the day was just about to end. Because it was a Saturday, they were ending right around 5 o'clock. Other days they would have probably worked until dark. But the workday was just coming to an end when the fire broke out.
So you say there were what, 500 or 600 people in the building at the just in the top 3 floors, right?
Yes, yes. The ninth floor in particular, the eighth floor was where they did the cutting, the designs, and they had some sewing machines, but not many. Ninth floor in particular, I think estimates are around 270 sewing machines. So at the very least, 270 seamstresses on the ninth floor. But then you add in the foreman, 4 women, managers, and other staff on that floor. And then you had on the 10th floor, you had the owner's offices, you had the shipping station, you had clerks, you had receptionists. So there were a lot of people there. Yeah.
How did the fire begin?
Best estimates, they think, is that a cutter who was someone who laid out, they're a very skilled worker working on the eighth floor. Cutters would lay out the designs and cut templates, and then they would go upstairs to be sewn by the seamstresses. They think a cutter was smoking a cigarette and put either the match or a cigarette butt in the trash bin, which was underneath the working stations.
So the fire spread obviously pretty quickly there was a lot of fuel there for it. Textiles certainly aren't or weren't made the way they are now to be fire retardant in many cases, especially when it comes to like children's pajamas and things like that we have rules and regulations for. So there was certainly plenty of fuel there. And from what I understand, the fire itself didn't last very long.
I mean, definitely less than 30 minutes, but I think they know for sure with fire department dispatch times, I think from the receipt of the first alarm until the fire was declared under control was about 18 minutes.
18 minutes.
So you figure the fire started a few minutes, obviously, before it was transmitted in, but
Mhm.
definitely less than a half hour, all this devastation, yeah.
And how many people died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire?
146.
146 people died.
Yeah.
So, just an incredible tragedy. Although, I guess considering how many people were in the building, it's fortunate that there weren't more of them. But why did so many of these people die?
I think a combination of factors. I think the two main factors would be there was no thought to fire drills or pre-planning. If there were an orderly evacuation process in place, I think many, many more could have been evacuated, if not all. And probably the biggest contributing factor is that one of the exit stairwells was maintained in a locked position. It was always padlocked shut because the owners wanted to funnel workers out of a different entrance, and they had a wooden partition built in front of it, making it even smaller. And inspectors would go through the seamstresses' handbags and coats at the end of the day to make sure they weren't stealing. So
Huh.
uh, it was very difficult to evacuate the floor once the evacuation started, and even that was delayed because of a lack of pre-planning and fire drills.
So, who owned the building?
The building was owned by a man named Joseph Ash, but the top three floors were rented by the Triangle Company.
Mhm. So,
Uh,
whose responsibility was it to have, or were there no mandated fire prevention types of initiatives back in 1911?
There were very little. And what makes this fire so significant is that many of the things we take for granted today were put in place because of this fire. One of the ironies is that many of the seamstresses from Triangle had only a year before gone on strike to fight for better conditions. And the owners of the Triangle Company, named Isaac Harris and Max Blank, they actually held out longer than any other owners. So many of these, mostly women, fought for better conditions just a year before. And so there was a knowledge that there was more to do. The fire chief, the New York City chief of department of the fire department at the time, a man named Edward Croker, who had become almost like a tabloid newspaper institution in New York. He'd been in the position over 10 years. He was very known among reporters and the public for speaking out on fire issues. And he had been arguing for improvements for fire inspectors, for better exits, for sprinklers in factories in particular. And he got a lot of pushback. Really, it wasn't until this fire that any of these changes were able to be enacted.
So there weren't very many, if any, safety measures put in place at the time.
There were buckets of water every few feet, which even for at the time is not insignificant. However, in this perhaps at this fire they may have worked against because a number of the workers, one of the managers in particular, a man named Samuel Bernstein, spent precious minutes at the beginning of the fire trying to put it out. Whereas perhaps, hindsight looking back, critiquing, perhaps that time would have been better spent just worrying about the evacuation. But that was about the only rule. No smoking. That was a rule that most factories did have even before, whether, it varied from place to place how hard it was enforced. That Triangle was actually enforced fairly well. It was known that you would be fired instantly for smoking on the floor. And yet this fire was caused by smoking.
And then
But
in 1911, we really didn't have what we know today as a fire extinguisher, did we?
uh, I don't believe there were pressurized extinguishers like we would call them. There might have been like gravity extinguishers. You turn them upside down and water comes out, and really buckets of water. Yeah, there weren't pressurized extinguishers like we would have today, or dry chemical extinguishers, and definitely sprinklers were very rare.
You mentioned the two owners of the factory. From what I understand, they had a reputation for using fire to gain financially if they saw fit. What do you know about their history there?
There's at least, I want to say, a handful of fires over the prior 10 years where they got considerable payments from fire insurance companies for fires on premises, always late at night when no one was there. And it's pretty well suspected that, the arson was almost like a go-to how to get rid of old inventory, and you get a quick payout from the insurance company. There definitely were very little follow-ups from insurance companies as far as investigations. The fire rider adjusters, I think they kind of worked on a commission basis. So if they were getting good premiums every month, they weren't asking too many questions. It definitely this far, even with the Triangle Fire, I think they received the modern day equivalent of a multi-million-dollar payout from this fire. And it's funny, the families of the victims got almost nothing, but the owners of the factories financially did well from it.
Did the owners ever take responsibility for the lives of the victims?
As far as I know, they, never like a public apology or anything like that. They were put on trial for manslaughter later in the year in 1911. And they had, a very famous lawyer at the time representing him who was, very good at his job. And he was able to really sow a lot of doubt, I think, with the jury as far as the witness statements of, they interviewed a lot of the survivors' witnesses, and he was able to sow just enough doubt. And really, all his burden of proof for the trial, the defense attorney and the two defendants, really were everything hinged on whether or not they knew the exit doors were locked. That's really all they were on trial for. Nothing else that was going on there was really illegal at the time. So, but if the exit doors were locked, they could have been considered guilty of negligence and manslaughter. And the prosecution wasn't able to prove that they knew the doors was locked, which is kind of a ridiculous premise. They certainly knew the doors were locked, as history would later prove, because one of the owners in particular, well after this fire, was in trouble again for locking exit doors at one of his factories. So it was a standard practice, I guess, of these particular owners, and profits and superseded safety.
So, what actions were taken after the fire to try to prevent a repeat of that tragedy?
I think probably most significantly, sprinklers began to be required in factory spaces. And in New York City, anyway, the New York City Fire Department finally got funding for a Bureau of Fire Prevention, which Chief Croker had been arguing for many years. And it was really the beginning of a new philosophy among firefighting. Up until then, everything was focused on extinguishment. And now, for the first time, you had inspectors out long before there was any fire, just inspecting premises for safety hazards and fire dangers, and requiring improvements. And that's something that's carried on to this day. Even in the New York City Fire Department, you have civilian inspectors who make fire safety inspections, and even the local firehouse, the firehouses, they inspect every building, and depending on the hazard of the buildings, depends. The frequency depends on the hazards, but they inspect all the buildings in the district on either an annual or 5-year basis, rolling basis.
Other than those inspections of which you speak, were there any other ways that the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire led to changing working conditions for people even today?
For sure. I think obviously this wasn't the beginning of the union movement. It had started before. But I think in many ways, this was the moment that gave society in the country lent a lot of credence to the unions' fights. Before that, unions had mixed results, whether it was in coal miners or railroad strikes. Depending, the strikers obviously felt very strongly about it, and families affected by it. But there was a lot of ambivalence in the country. If your train wasn't going to run on time, or the things you depended on were strike, you might be more sympathetic to the owners. I think the plight of the victims of the Triangle really brought to consciousness, in light of the fact that many of these seamstresses had struck the year before to improve conditions, really gave a boost to the union movement and gave credibility that maybe before had not been as prevalent in all, across society.
Now, of course, in 1911, news did not travel as quickly as it does today, but certainly there must have been a reaction from the people who lived and worked in that immediate area. What was there shock? Was there disbelief? Was there, did somebody just say, well, we knew this was going to happen sooner or later? What was the prevailing attitude of it among the citizenry then?
I think one of the things that made this fire such an event that it was is that it happened in as basically public a manner and in as real time a manner as anything could at that time. There were hundreds and hundreds of spectators on the street. It was a crowded, nice early spring day in New York City. People were out and about, and the fire broke out. And many of the fire, it was a very big building, a corner building, had high visibility. Everyone in the area knew the building, and a large crowd gathered very quickly when the smoke started. And with fire coming out the windows of the upper floors of the building, it was quite the sensation. And then, most significantly, I think a majority of the deaths, I want to say maybe over 70 or 80 of the deaths were people who jumped from upper floor windows because they had no choice. So it played out right in front of people. There was photographers, there were reporters, and it was widely reported in a very graphic, especially for the time, manner. Pictures of bodies on the sidewalk, bodies in the street. Reporters were reporting how they had watched people jump. Almost, 9 stories up sounds like a lot, but I've actually visited the building, and what strikes out is like you stare up at the ninth floor windows and you realize like you can see somebody's face, you make eye contact with them. It's not that far. And a lot of the reporters note like looking at these young women, some girls really, many of them, just with the fear in their eyes and looking into their face and watching it as they just, losing all hope, just jumped because it was better than burning. And it really affected a lot of people, the reports of exactly how this fire played out.
Now, you correct me if I'm wrong, but you seem to have indicated that the owners were in the building that Saturday.
They were.
How did they get out? They were on the 10th floor,
They
correct?
were on the 10th floor, and most of the people on the 10th floor survived. They were able to get to a stairwell, the one stairwell that went to the roof, and they all went to the roof. And then they were able to cross over to New York University had the next building over, and they were able to cross over to the adjoining rooftop, and they got out that way.
It's kind of strange how probably no one on the 8th floor even knew that there was a way out by going up.
Right. I think every floor had kind of different circumstances. I think I believe almost everybody on the 8th floor got out because the fire, they were there when it started, so they had time to get out. And the elevator operators, there were two elevator operators who were very brave. They kept making trips up through smoke, through fire, and in old accordion style elevators. So there was very little protection. And they made trip after trip until the elevators finally failed. So many of the on the 8th floor, they got out either through elevators or through the stairs because the fire was in its early stages. Another issue that led to so many of the deaths was the type of communications. A worker on the 8th floor called on the telephone. She tried, it's funny, it's called a telautograph machine. It was a very early forerunner of a fax machine that they had in this building. And for some reason, her initial notification to the 10th floor was the modern day equivalent of a fax. She faxed the word fire on a piece of paper and sent it upstairs. And then nobody answered. And so then finally she called on the telephone upstairs. The receptionist on the 10th floor answered. And by this point, the woman on the 8th floor was screaming. And the woman on the 10th floor, yelled out fire to everyone on the 10th floor. And then she just kind of left the phone there and didn't hang it up. It was like a switchboard type telephone. So now the woman on the 8th floor couldn't even call the 9th floor to tell anyone on the 9th floor. So the ninth floor, and with the, it was a thick building, thick floors, thick walls. They weren't immediately, the conditions weren't immediately known on the ninth floor that there was a fire below them. Really until they saw smoke outside the windows rising on the outside. So by then, now smoke, fire started spreading to the one stairwell that wasn't locked. It became blocked by fire very, very quickly. And like I said, the other stairwell was locked. A number of trips of elevators trips did stop at the ninth floor, and many were saved that way, but many weren't.
What did firefighters learn from the disaster?
I think a lot. They, you got to remember that the equipment of the day certainly wasn't what it was today. One issue that everyone on the scene noticed right away is that actually the tallest ladder in the city arrived at the scene and raised its ladder up, and it only reached the sixth floor. So it was not able to reach the ninth floor where most of the people were trapped, and that was just the technology of the day. There was very little at that time that could have been done about that. The buildings were getting taller and taller, outpacing the firefighters' capability. One thing that, from a firefighting point of view, the fire actually went out fairly quickly, and that was probably largely due to Chief Edward Croker, his efforts over the prior decade to institute a high pressure water system in Lower Manhattan. He had pumps built on the Hudson River to pump a very large diameter water main across Lower Manhattan. Because of these high-rise and factory loft buildings, water pressure from the regular city main is not sufficient really to pump water up multiple flights of, because you have gravity working against you. And the steam engines that fire engines at the time had couldn't add enough pressure to make water reach the upper floor. So he fought actually successfully. It's one of the few things he was able to get over the years, a high pressure water main in Lower Manhattan. And the firefighters, when they were on the scene, they actually had a good water pressure on the upper floors fairly quickly from the time they arrived. And from their point of view, they put the fire out relatively quickly. It was just too late for dozens and dozens of people who had been trapped on window ledges, before then. One of the chiefs, it wasn't Chief Croker, it was his successor, testifying at one of the trials for this, was asked by one of the legislators and said, "But this is a fireproof building. We don't understand." And his answer was, "Yes, the building may be fireproof, but the people inside it aren't." So fireproof is probably a misnomer for buildings. The type of construction might slow the spread of fire, and maybe the structural elements of the building don't burn as quickly. They were able to resist the fire, but all the contents of the building, obviously, if there's bales of fabric on the floors, they burn, and people inside it obviously are in danger of fire.
Now, you wrote a book about this event, as from what I understand. Tell me about that.
Correct. It's a historical novel that basically is centered around the event of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, but also the lives that intertwine, the seamstresses, the young firefighters, especially the owners of the building, and Chief Croker, and many of the politicians of the day, and kind of the what created this perfect storm that led to this moment.
And was politics one of those factors?
For sure, because New York City obviously goes back to the 1600s, but the five-borough city of New York that we know today was only a little over 10 years old at this time. The five boroughs were united in, I think, 1898. And it was basically a deal, like kind of like a movement among politicians at the time, because New York City was under the control of Tammany Hall, which is the political machine that controlled the Democratic Party, and then by default, all of New York City politics, and much of life in New York City was controlled by this organization called Tammany Hall. And they had political bosses who basically made all the decisions behind the scenes that mayors and councilmen and all, enacted in public. So everything basically had to be kind of filtered through this second tier of governing, So there was the factory owners definitely had their say. They, money obviously always gets you power. The nascent progressive movement, which started right around the turn of the century, was rising, and it was actually starting to push back against Tammany Hall's control. But this actually caused some further strife because Tammany Hall, a lot of the new reforms where Tammany Hall basically patronage was taken away from them, they couldn't dole out, civil service jobs the way they used to in the 19th century. So now they had to find a new power base, because you had civil service reform. So now Tammany Hall is basically looking to how they're going to grow their power coming into the new century. And in a lot of ways, maybe the owners were able to have a lot more influence than they might have a few years earlier, whereas the workers might have been more of a thought for Tammany leaders. So there's that push and pull between all these forces going on at the time.
So what is the title of the book?
The book is called Hell's 100 Acres, which is basically a nickname given to this area of Manhattan in the 1950s, I believe, by the fire commissioner at the time, because by then all of these factory loft buildings that were so prevalent at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, much of the manufacturing by the 1950s had moved out of New York City and moved on, and these factory lofts were starting to deteriorate, and there were a very big fire hazard at the time, these abandoned factory lofts. And they would go on in the coming decades to become home to artists, and that's where Soho grew out of, and now it's very trendy. But at that time, it was a very dangerous area. And I think you start to see, what I tried to show in the book is where, how these buildings, they're so characteristic to the neighborhood, but they have their own story to tell in a way, the dangers they brought and the changes to everyday life.
Andrew Serra's novel about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is called Hell's 100 Acres, and it's available now wherever you buy books. In fact, Andrew Serra's written a number of books that you'll find interesting. Many thanks to Andrew for spending some time in the Listening Tube. The Listening Tube is written and produced by yours truly. Copyright 2025. Thank you for putting your ear to the Listening Tube. Support the show or text me from the homepage. I'm your host, Bob Woodley, for Thou Ad Infinitum.